under siege, and all of its inhabitants were trapped inside the city. There were even pilgrims who had come months and months before for Passover, not knowing what was about to happen, and suddenly the hostilities with the Romans began and they were stuck in the city. But the truth was that it was not quite so dire, because it was a stalemate. The Romans couldn't get in and the Jews couldn't get out. The Romans, not wanting to give up, built a trench around the entire city and set up a permanent camp to trap anyone who tried to leave the city. So they waited. And it had already been this very tumultuous, difficult time for Israel, decade, even a century, where everybody was infighting. There were different groups of zealots fighting each other and the Romans. And all the institutions of the time had been gone into corruptions, institutions that stood for hundreds, even 1,000 years. The whole scene was very well portrayed humorously in Monty Python's Life of O'Brien. Right? The People's Front of Judea, the only ones they hate more than the Romans are the Judean People's Front. But even the zealots at first, after the Romans began to construct ramparts and to take the siege even further, the two most important leaders of those zealots came together to fight the common enemy, the Romans. But it didn't last very long. And they came to this key moment where the siege was underway of Jerusalem, and there was still a chance for the inhabitants, but they were wavering what to do. Some of them wanted to give themselves up, and the zealots were so angry that they didn't want to stand up to the Romans that they gathered a huge stockpile of food and burnt it to force them to fight the Romans. We can imagine what happens when you're under siege and somebody burns all your food. Thousands of people died of starvation, and they basically gave up. And not long after, the Romans breached the walls and burned Jerusalem and burnt the temple, and that was the end of that. And this story is why we read this parsha almost every year in the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, Pinchas. Right? Who is Pinchas? Pinchas is a zealot. The Midianites had taken over the Jewish camp, and the plague had broken out, and a prince of Israel was caught in the act with a Midianite princess right in front of the tent of meeting. And Pinchas, outraged, grabbed a spear and impaled both of them on the spear. And that act stopped the divine plague. But the rabbis who took over after that story mentioned at the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, who took over helping Judaism survive, they weren't so impressed by this act. In the Midrash they say, Pinchas hu Eliyahu. Pinchas is just like Elijah. And to the rabbis, Elijah wasn't just a prophet and a man of God, but Elijah was also a zealot, someone who refused to budge from his position and from his righteousness against those he thought were enemies of God and Judaism. Elijah was uncompromising. As he himself states in the book of Kings, I have been very zealous for the Lord. And Elijah was not adverse to acts of murder if that was what he needed, even as a prophet, to control the situation, as we see when after the confrontation on Mount Carmel, he leads the killing of 450 priests of Baal in a dramatic showdown. So when the rabbis invite Elijah at every bris, as we still observe thousands of years later, when the rabbis said that that's what happens, it wasn't actually a positive thing. It was a punishment for the blood that Elijah caused for the Jewish people, and so in return he had to witness blood at every bris. Because the rabbis wanted to warn the people about where zealotry and self-righteousness leads. The self-righteousness leads to destruction. And the path that they embraced as they picked up the pieces of Judaism was a completely different path. It was the path of moderation. Right? Maimonides' teacher taught that we should do everything with moderation, even in the realm of religious piety. Even there we should be moderate. We should be middle of the road. And people's needs and feelings have to always be taken into account and viewed with compassion. And pikuach nefesh, saving a human life, well, that's the most important thing that there is. And that takes precedence over ideologies, even halakha, God's will, in many circumstances. And what the sages believed was more important in all considerations was taking care of people, and that the people should be united. They should feel connected to each other. And when they looked at that period of corruption at the end days of the temple, they described it disparagingly to show how different groups, right, the People's Front of Judea and the Judeans People Front, were at each other's throat for minor disagreement. And one of the most violent disagreements between the factions, between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that caused untold violence, was the one group believed that when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, he would light the incense just before he went in the Holy of Holies, and the other group believed he lit it once he was already in the Holy of Holies. That was a difference between the two factions, and it led them to even high priests being deposed over such quibbles. So they said, what does God care about? God cares about people, about their welfare. And despite how our tradition can sometimes look to our modern eyes, the rabbis tried to be very flexible and put many compromises. And the Talmud even states God cares about the money of Israel. God cares about the financial situation of the Jewish people. God cares about that. And for thousands of years, even with all of the difficulties of Pesach cleaning, the rabbis taught you don't really need that second set of dishes. Just take your set of dishes and clean it off. That's okay. You don't need more than that. And it says in the Torah, everybody needs to have a lulav and etrog on Sukkot. And I said, well, if you have a lulav and etrog and you give it to your neighbor and say, I give it to you, that's okay. And if you look at Shabbat in the Torah, you have to stay inside your house for the entirety of Shabbat in the dark. But what do the rabbis say? They say, well, if you light a fire before Shabbat, it's okay, it doesn't matter. And we can allow you to leave your house by putting a little string around an entire city, and that makes your whole city your house. And now you can actually get out of your house on Shabbat and go see other people. So it sounds a little meshuggah to us, but it was actually trying to make life's easier. And if there's any danger to your health whatsoever, Shabbat doesn't matter. Right? The very first Rabbi Hillel, at one point is stuck in the cold on Shabbat, and his two teachers bring him in and light a fire on Shabbat. No problem. You have to take care of other human beings. So they created endless loopholes and ways around all the strictures to make life more compassionate, more livable, more understanding. And ideology, not as important. But take care of your health, take care of your body, take care of the community. And even in America, in the first half of the 20th century, Orthodox rabbis would tell their congregants, if you have to work on Shabbat to make ends meet, that's okay. And it's why during this pandemic, when we saw how the ultra-Orthodox were not observing the very basic tenets of looking after pikuach nefesh, saving a life, that so many of us were upset. But God worries about the well-being of his people, and self-righteousness and zealotry lead to destruction. So right now, we are living at a time of zealotry, where the more fire each person can conjure in their social media tweets or statement earns more points from their followers. And compromise, moderation, understanding, taking care of everyone else's needs, that just is weakness, a distant value amidst the hard-edged debates of our time. Politicians don't even try to answer the questions from journalists. They just try to repeat the points that will fire up their base. And newspapers not doing much better. And people's lives are annulled and sacrificed on the altar of ideological purity. Now, tradition understands that there are times when zealots can save a situation that would otherwise be disastrous, but they also point to the heavy price that is paid. And so these 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av are a time to contemplate that destructive power of zealotry and self-righteousness, and to recommit to the path of moderation, of understanding, of love of all of Israel, of placing people before ideologies, of placing our humanity at the very center of our faith and our worldview. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with our Chetzi Kaddish. We are on page 184.
יתקדר ויתקדש שמי רבה, ילמד דברי קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וימי חון.